Hello, and welcome to Unit 1.2. Here we're going to discuss how and why water reuse risk varies with reuse application and also with geographical region. At the end of this module, learners will be able to understand how water reuse risk varies with different end uses, identify different geographical risk factors for water reuse, and describe the institutional, regulatory, and social perception differences related to water reuse risk. Different reuse applications means there will be a combination of different exposure pathways. In agricultural irrigation, the risk will be different for the workers in the field who may come into direct contact with irrigation water on their skin or by inhalation of water droplets in the air, compared to the public who will consume the agricultural products as food. Short-term risks, such as from pathogenic microbes, should be considered for relevant receptors, as well as for longer-term risks, such as high chemical or metal concentrations. The fact that scientific studies and epidemiological data are not likely to exist for all possible types of exposure in all situations is the reason why risk analysis and risk assessment approaches are used. Estimating the likely risk levels given the knowledge currently available, allowing for a margin of error considering that our knowledge is imperfect. For industrial reuse applications, there tends to be low direct exposure. However, there can be indirect exposure risks due to increased corrosion or fouling of equipment that can lead to unexpected exposure events. Depending on the industry and application, exposure events may lead to large and expensive disruptions in operations, requiring investigation and coordination and cooperation with investigating authorities, as well as ongoing public relations activities to communicate with the public and key stakeholders. Urban reuse applications may create moderate exposure risks for uses such as sports field watering and street cleaning. What is considered safe water reuse may change depending on the management actions put in place to reduce exposure to all groups or to reduce exposure to groups identified as having a higher vulnerability. Additionally, where groundwater recharge is used as a storage method, long-term chemical and microbial risks may be a higher priority for risk assessment. The risks associated with water reuse in Europe varies significantly across regions due to differences in climate, hydrology, water availability, governance, and public perception. While the European Union provides a common regulatory framework, its implementation and interpretation differ across member states, reflecting national priorities, environmental conditions, and social attitudes, including both real and perceived risk. Northern Europe generally experiences abundant water resources and lower levels of water stress. As a result, the economic and environmental incentives to pursue large-scale water reuse projects have tended to be limited compared to more arid regions. The cooler climate in northern countries, such as the Scandinavian countries, reduces the growth and persistence of microbial pathogens, thereby lowering public health risks related to reuse applications. However, local hydrogeological conditions, including soil permeability and groundwater vulnerability, can influence the potential for contamination during infiltration or managed aquifer recharge, requiring careful site-specific assessment. In contrast, Southern Europe faces chronic water scarcity, particularly in Mediterranean countries such as Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus. The climatic drivers of drought and seasonal water deficits make water reuse a strategic necessity to ensure water security for agriculture, tourism, and urban supply. However, warmer temperatures promote pathogen survival and regrowth in treated effluents, increasing microbial risks if disinfection and monitoring are inadequate. Evaporation losses and higher nutrient loads can further affect reuse system performance. Consequently, southern regions must balance the urgent need for alternative water sources with robust risk management to safeguard public and environmental health. At the EU level, there is a harmonised framework for agricultural water reuse, defining quality classes, monitoring requirements, and risk management obligations. However, national transposition and implementation vary widely. Countries such as Spain, Portugal, and Cyprus have adopted proactive reuse governance frameworks supported by technical guidelines, dedicated institutions, and integration with irrigation and regional water planning. These countries have experience in risk assessment and management, particularly for agricultural applications. In contrast, some other, particularly northern member states, take a more precautionary approach, emphasizing public health protection and strict microbiological criteria and management actions. Reuse may be limited mostly to applications for research or closed system industrial contexts. However, due to climate change and more regular drought periods, some approaches may be changing. Monitoring frequency, analytical parameters, and enforcement practices also differ substantially, reflecting varying administrative capacities and regulatory philosophies. Effective coordination between health, environmental, and project permitting authorities remains essential to ensure comprehensive risk control, especially for projects involving multiple sectors or reuse purposes. Risk perception surrounding water reuse is not purely technical. It's deeply linked to trust, transparency, and social acceptance. Public attitudes often depend on emotional and cultural factors, including the so-called yuck factor, where psychological aversion to recycled water can outweigh scientific evidence of safety. Building public confidence requires clear communication, transparency in monitoring data, and inclusive stakeholder engagement during planning and implementation. Countries that have invested in public awareness and participatory processes demonstrate higher acceptance levels. For example, Cyprus has combined large-scale reuse programs with communication campaigns, emphasizing safety and necessity, while France has implemented pilot reuse projects that involve local stakeholders in decision-making and risk evaluation. What influences public trust in reuse in your country? And finally, here are 3 key takeaways from this lesson. Risk in water reuse is a function of use, region, and context. Technical, institutional, and social factors all influence outcomes and must be taken into account in the development of reuse projects, and good governance and transparent communication can reduce the perceived risk of water reuse projects. Thanks for your attention, and don't hesitate if you have any questions.